Okay, so synaptic transmission, just gave you a quick graphic over here. As you can see, there's postsynaptic and presynaptic neuron. Presynaptic is obviously first. It releases neurotransmitters, and they travel across the synaptic cleft, which is right over here, onto the receptors. And that's what I mean when I say input. I've been using the word input a lot. It's just any sort of signal that the postsynaptic neuron receives from anything before it. So in this case, it releases a neurotransmitter. It diffuses across the synaptic cleft. It attaches to these receptors. And sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's enough to depolarize the membrane enough to hit that threshold and trigger an action potential. So it's basically, nervous system transmission is basically just a series of that throughout your body. So there are two types of synaptic transmission, electrical and chemical. Electrical, it's usually just discussed very quickly and touched upon. It's used in cells that are attached to each other by gap junction. So these are not really neurons. Neurons don't really engage usually in electrical synapse. This is for like cardiac tissue, like smooth muscle cell. They're actually connected, and the cytoplasm of them are connected. So they can communicate very easily and very quickly. It allows muscle to contract uniformly. Right, it's mostly found in smooth muscle cell, cardiac muscle. Gap junctions and electrical synapses are also responsible for coordinating muscle contractions during childbirth, for example. The action potential can directly spread from one cell to the next because of the connection. So it's kind of similar to the electrical impulses of a neuron, but instead of when it gets to the end of the cell, it doesn't release neurotransmitters or release any sort of chemical. The electrical signal just goes right through those gap junctions. Gap junctions are just small openings that are connecting adjacent cells. So because the cytoplasm it's continuous, the ions can flow freely through the electrical synapses, and it makes for very highly coordinated movements and contractions. So the other one, which is more of our area of interest for this lesson, are chemical synapses, which we were just talking about. So those are found where the synaptic terminal meets its target cell. It could be an effector, which is like a muscle or some sort of organ, or it could just be another neuron, like we saw in the graphic before. So the two cells do not make direct contact in a chemical synapse, which is important to understand. The synaptic cleft is the little space between the two of them. So they can't touch, they're not touching, and the way they communicate is chemically. So that electrical signal is converted into a chemical signal, it crosses over the synaptic cleft, and then it is again turned into an electrical signal to travel down the second axon of the second neuron. The synaptic terminal releases the neurotransmitters via exocytosis. So what that means is that there are little vesicles inside the synaptic terminal that contain the neurotransmitter. These little vesicles, whenever an action potential reaches the end, they move closer toward the membrane. The membrane sort of associates with the vesicle, and then it sort of spits out the neurotransmitter, and it travels across the synaptic cleft, as we said, and it touches the postsynaptic neuron. So they initiate action potentials to continue the transmission of the information. And after the transmission, neurotransmitters are degraded. There are some enzymes that degrade the neurotransmitters while they're in the synaptic cleft. And then there's also a process known as reuptake, which is of importance in modern medicine, especially I'm sure some of you have heard of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I see a question about that at least once on almost every MCAT that I've taken. They really like to ask that. And it's a pretty good way to gauge your knowledge about the nervous system, I think, and psychology. So reuptake is just exactly what it is. Taking the presynaptic neuron takes up any of the neurotransmitter and it recycles them and it can use them again. And the degrading of the neurotransmitters and reuptake is also what stops the action potential. So if these processes didn't happen, then there would just be neurotransmitter just chilling in the synaptic cleft, binding to the postsynaptic neuron and just like firing haywire. So the way that we stop that, the way that we stop the transmission, we degrade some neurotransmitters and some are taken up by the presynaptic neuron. So Keith said, what is a gap junction? A gap junction is just a small connection between adjacent cells. So say you have two cardiac cells, they're next to each other, they will have little pores that are connected to each other. And their cytoplasm it's continuous throughout them. So whenever one cytoplasm hyperpolarizes, if there's a change in the ion concentration, it's going to carry over to the next one. So yeah, like Janelle said, it allows direct cell-to-cell transfer of ions and small molecules. So it's super efficient, and it allows these cells to communicate almost instantaneously. Not instantaneously, because it does take, milliseconds. Yeah, through a channel. They're just like, think of them as little pores. So if you have two cells that are up next to each other, there are little holes that are connecting the cytoplasm of the two. And it's, like I said, they're confluent. So whenever one change happens, it very quickly changes the cell to the next of it. It's just another way. We use the word synapse, even though it's a little bit different than a chemical synapse, because they are touching, but it's just a way that the two cells communicate with each other. So like for cardiac tissue, when you send an electrical impulse, you want all of that tissue to contract at the same time. So if you use a chemical synapse, there's going to be a little bit of a delay. So electrical synapses do act a little bit quicker, and it allows for coordinated movement. Does anybody have any other questions on that? Cool. Okay, so neurotransmitters. You should be familiar with the neurotransmitters and how they both oversupply and undersupply affects the human body. I don't know what I was going for with that one, but this to the left, it gives you all of the major neurotransmitters that you'll see. Acetylcholine, definitely dopamine, serotonin. I would definitely familiarize yourself with all of these, their basic functions. And then just maybe, yeah, like for the two lower ones, if they're inhibitory, if they're excitatory, usually GABA and glutamate, those are really the context in which they'll ask questions, is really just if it's inhibitory or excitatory. And I would definitely, I'm not going to spend too much time going over it, but this is really good for your own studying purposes. I've noticed that the MCAT really likes to test malfunction. When they talk about neurotransmitters, they love testing malfunction. So like I've seen a lot of questions where it asks, what happens when there's an oversupply of dopamine. So you should be, pretty familiar with, okay, if there's an oversupply of dopamine, that's linked to schizophrenia. Those are pretty common questions that I see on the MCAT. So the parasympathetic nervous system uses acetylcholine to transfer information across synapses. So keep that in mind. The parasympathetic nervous system, which we will talk about in a couple of slides, is a division of the autonomic nervous system. It uses acetylcholine basically exclusively as a neurotransmitter. And the sympathetic nervous system uses acetylcholine as well for preganglionic neurons and norepinephrine for postganglionic neurons. And if you need a little refresher on what pre and postganglionic neurons are, we're going to go over that a little bit as well. Does anybody have any questions about the neurotransmitters? Anything about the malfunctions? Anything about their functions? How you may be tested? Because the stuff that I put to the right, we're gonna review that now within the next couple of slides. So don't be freaked out if you see a couple of terms on this slide that you're not familiar with. Right. Yeah. So they're, like Janelle was saying, the second section, you will see the nervous system a lot, because the nervous system does pop up a lot, especially with psychology. When you're talking about cognition, even when you're talking about clinical psychology, malfunctions of the nervous system are responsible for a lot of that stuff. So going over the nervous system is pretty important. It'll help you in multiple sections. It will help you in multiple sections of the MCAT.